It is Halloween, and skeletons are a common motif on Halloween, whether it be decorations like this, which is surprisingly realistic since it's made out of styrofoam, or skeleton costumes, which are very popular Halloween costumes. A 2019 edition of Time magazine suggests that the connection between Halloween and skeletons might be related to a medieval fascination with skeletons, both from the perspective of developing medical science and from a religious perspective as symbols of death. How a culture views and depicts and disposes of human remains says a lot about its people, but they also might be related to specific historical events. And one unique way of dealing with human remains is an ossuary, which is the deliberate disinterment, collection, and sometimes decorative display of human bones. It might seem a macabre practice to the modern mind, but it's surprisingly common throughout history. It's been used by multiple cultures across multiple continents, from prehistory to surprisingly modern times. The history of displaying our bones deserves to be remembered. An ossuary represents a unique way of treating human remains, as archaeologist Dennis C. Curry explains. By definition, they are secondary graves, meaning that the remains were initially buried or stored elsewhere and then disinterred or amassed for reburial in a single collective grave. The term itself is derived from the Latin word osso, meaning bone. Writing in a 2015 edition of the journal Archaeology of Eastern North America, Curry, formerly the chief archaeologist for the Maryland Historical Trust, was talking specifically in reference to prehistoric ossuaries along the North American Atlantic coasts, which he describes as a common form of internment practiced during late prehistory, with true ossuaries found as far south as South Carolina and as far north as Cape Cod, as well as among the Huron people in the Great Lakes region. While he can describe the nature of ossuary pits and associated grave objects, Curry notes that even more elusive may be the meaning of ossuaries, although he writes, "We may conjecture." Perhaps, some researchers suggest, the prolonged period of primary internment, followed by communal reburial, allows for a period of mourning on an individual personal basis, followed by an act of closure, which may mark both the end of the mourning period and symbolize the sense of community among the dead. It might also mark the transformation of the skeletal remains from those of a specific individual to those of an anonymous member of a communal group. He notes one researcher speculating that ossuary interment completes the process from physical death to social death. It is only after the ossuary ritual that an individual's spirit is released into the afterlife, and thus finally joining the spirits of its ancestors. However, other researchers suggest that ossuaries had political meaning unique to their time, with one researcher arguing that they reflect the political realities of the chiefdoms that formed just prior to European contact, and that they were part of the process by which native peoples defined themselves as a group, distinct from other groups. While contending that they are still enigmatic, Curry argues that ossuaries may provide a key to understanding early Middle Atlantic societies and help decipher Native American social, political, and belief systems. That conclusion represents a fundamental truth. How we deal with our dead says a lot about who we are. And reburial in an ossuary offers us insights both into human culture and human history. For example, among the earliest ossuaries found are among the Sogdian people, an ancient civilization located in present-day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. Mazdaism, although more commonly known today as Zoroastrianism, is considered one of the world's oldest organized religions, dating to as far back as the 2nd millennium BC. The website of the Zoroastrianism Heritage Institute explains, a guiding principle of Zoroastrian funerary practices is to prevent rotting flesh from coming into contact with the soil, water, and fire. The environment, land, air, and water, as well as the element of fire, should not be polluted when disposing of a dead body, and the living should not be harmed in any way. Thus, the Smithsonian Institution explains, Sogdians exposed their dead to carrion-eating dogs and birds, and then gathered the bones in ossuaries. However, while the practice was related to the faith, it differed across the culture and across time. Some communities disposed of the bleached and dried bones in communal pits, while others placed them in jars, whose design also varied over space and time as methods of construction changed. Thus, while the governing principles were based in shared religious beliefs, the actual placement of the bones might be related to how egalitarian a particular community was, or whether they thought the rich and the poor should be united in death. The use of the practice is related to both faith and culture and technology. Professor Stephen Fine of Yeshiva University makes a similar conclusion regarding a similar practice in the Second Temple period of Jerusalem. Ancient Jews practiced secondary burial, gathering into bone boxes called ossuaries the bones of their dead a year or so after death, when the flesh had desiccated and fallen off. Fine writes in the journal Biblical Archaeology Review in 2001, the practice continued for approximately 100 years and then disappeared. The problem that has vexed scholars ever since these Jewish ossuaries have become known, Fire explains, is why, for this short period of time, did the Jews of Israel's holiest city, Jerusalem, use ossuaries? The practice developed suddenly, and just as suddenly, stopped. Noting that scholars have traditionally suggested that the practice had to do with preparing the bones for resurrection, Fine argues that this doesn't explain why the practice halted abruptly after the destruction of the temple. Rather, he notes, the period of the use of ossuaries coincided with Herod's massive construction project, rebuilding the temple and the city. The professor postulates that the use of carved stone ossuaries was connected to the growth of the stone carving industry that came with the massive construction process. He writes, when the city was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, ossuary burial practically stopped. This strongly suggests that Jewish ossuary burial was tied to the culture and prosperity of first century Jerusalem. His conclusion, then, is that the practice was related to historical and economic events which affected both the availability of these stone ossuaries and the perception of a person's place within society. While burial practices are almost always impacted by both culture and religion, they serve practical purposes as well. Ossuaries were often used simply because we needed more space. An April 2022 article on the website of the World Economic Forum notes a recent study that estimates that 109 billion people have lived and died in the last 192,000 years. That's a whole lot of corpses, and it raises a question. What do we do with all those human remains? One reason behind ossuaries is the simple fact that bones take up less space than a whole body. The website Cake, which focuses on end-of-life planning, explains, ossuaries typically hold more than just one person's skeletal remains. Since they only hold bones, a community could inter many more remains in an ossuary than in a cemetery, columbarium, or tomb. This made ossuaries a popular choice throughout history for cities and towns with limited burial space. And that is a big part of the reasoning behind the world's largest and perhaps best known ossuary, the Paris catacombs. A March 2014 edition of Smithsonian Magazine writes, as Paris grew into its role as a major European hub, it eventually ran into a major problem. By the 17th century, enough people had lived and died in Paris that its cemeteries were overflowing, overstuffed with graves to the point where corpses, at times, became uncovered. The conditions finally led King Louis XV to issue an edict in 1763 banning new burials within the city, but those corpses in the already overcrowded cemeteries remained. But the problem finally became untenable in 1780. That year, Smithsonian explains, a prolonged period of spring rain caused a wall around the Les Innocents Cemetery to collapse, spilling rotting corpses into a neighboring property. But the issue of corpses, which are at times literally spilling in through collapsed basement walls, happened to coincide with another issue. The website Big Think explains, sediments left behind by ancient seas created large deposits of limestone in the south of the city, mostly south of the Seine, and gypsum in the north, particularly in the hills of Montmartre and Ménilmontant, highly sought after as building materials. Both have been mined since Roman times. That is, for centuries, while bodies were piling up in Parisian cemeteries, mines were being dug underneath sections of the city for the limestone from which many of its greatest buildings were built. And those abandoned mines are becoming their own problem, Big Think notes. In previous centuries, a road would occasionally open up to swallow a chariot, or even a whole house would disappear down a sinkhole. In 1778, a catastrophic subsidence in Ménilmontant killed 7. In response, Louis XVI created a commission called Inspection Générale des Carrières, or Bureau of Mine Inspection. The commission had the responsibility to map and, where necessary, reinforce the miles of abandoned mines underneath the city. But the problem of abandoned mines meant a solution for the problem of too many dead Parisians. The city's cemeteries were condemned, and the official website of the Paris catacombs explains, the tombs, common graves, and charnel house were emptied of their bones, which were transported at night to avoid hostile reactions from the Parisian population in the church. The bones were dumped into 2 quarry wells and then distributed and piled into the galleries by the quarry workers. While most new remains were buried in new cemeteries outside the city, some dead were buried directly in the catacombs, with bones deposited there up until 1860. Over time, the remains of between 6 and 7 million people were moved to what became known as the catacombs. But the catacombs were more than just a convenient place to deposit bones. Starting in 1810, the chief inspector directed that the bones be carefully arranged. The official website continues. The bones, which had previously been loosely piled, were carefully organized in walls, according to a quarry backfill arrangement. The facade consisted of rows of tibia alternating with skulls, and the remaining bones were piled behind the wall. Organized using a museographical and monumental approach, the idea was to make the ossuary a mausoleum that could be visited. The website Offbeat France writes, "You'll see plenty of astonishing things. Bones built up into unusual shapes and structures, signs with names of the streets above, small rooms with vaults. Rather than the grim and gory scenes you might expect, the bones have been positioned to please, a decision made long ago by then General Inspector of the Quarries, Henry Carr de Thury, who set up the bones as a museum with spectacular architectural structures such as Doric columns, plaques, altars, and unusually shaped structures, many of which are considered works of art." First opened to the public in 1809, the website notes that displays encourage visitors towards introspection and a meditation on death. Thus, the Paris catacombs represent both the city's history and a place to consider the nature of mortality. While it is undoubtedly a popular attraction, there's particular meaning in making the catacombs, which represent only a small fraction of the mines, a place for visitation. Atlas Obscura explains. Throughout ancient and medieval times, and in the Catholic and Orthodox faiths, displaying and maintaining the bones of the deceased was a way to honor the dead. Honoring the dead in an ossuary is particular meaning in Eastern Orthodox monastic tradition. Theologian Timothy Ware writes in his 1964 book, God and Man, "Because Orthodox are convinced that the body is sanctified and transfigured together with the soul, they have an immense reverence for the relics of saints. This reverence for relics is not the fruit of ignorance and superstition, but springs from a highly developed theology of the body." The website Orthodox Christian Faith and Life explains that the bodies of Orthodox monks are usually buried for 3 years, and then the remains disinterred. If the flesh is sufficiently rotted away, the bones are cleaned and transferred to an ossuary. As for the empty grave, the website writes, "It is now ready to grant rest for another 3 years to somebody else after his repose." The website continues, "Any inhabitant of the monastery can at any time enter the ossuary and in solitude reflect on the transience of life. Looking at the bones of monks whom he once knew, or those who have reposed century ago, it is unlikely that one would not come to the thought that they themselves will one day also find rest here, along with their fellow brethren." And some of the most extreme examples of ways to display bones are in the Sedlec's ossuary in the Czech Republic. In 1278, a Cistercian monk went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and brought back a bag of earth taken from the site of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He spread the earth across the cemetery of a Cistercian monastery. The website of the Sedlec's ossuary explains, "The rumor about his act soon spread out all over the place, and thus Sedlec's became a desired place to be buried. Eventually too desirable, especially following mass deaths due to war and the Black Death. In the 15th century, a church was built with a chapel intended to act as an ossuary," Atlas Obscura writes. "There simply wasn't enough room for everyone to rest in peace, and the bodies were moved to a crypt to make room for the newly dead. While the bones were originally organized by what was described as a half-blind monk, the website of the ossuary writes that in 1870, a local woodcarver, František Rindt, was given the task to decorate the chapel with the bones. 40,000 human bones are now arranged, and the place is now popularly known as the Church of Bones." Atlas Obscura describes the work as some of the world's more macabre art. But what is the purpose of a chandelier made of bones, or a bone coat of arms, especially in a church that still regularly holds services? While the macabre might be what primarily attracts some 450,000 tourists a year, local resident Jerry Sober told CNN in 2019, "It's a place where we can go and connect with our family that are no longer with us, a place of rest for those who have died." The Douaumont ossuary in France contrasts with the Church of Bones. A repository for the bones of nearly 130,000 unnamed dead, both French and German, from the World War I Battle of Verdun, Atlas Obscura writes, Unlike the neatly stacked piles in the catacombs or in church ossuaries, the bones of the dead soldiers are simply in heaping piles, which strangely feels more appropriate for the violent and tragic way they died, and helps illustrate the sheer scale of death during World War I. Built at the suggestion of the Bishop of Verdun, it took 12 years to build the building in which the ossuary is housed. In addition to the bones, the sanctuary includes engravings of the names of more than 4,000 soldiers who died in the battle. The website French Moments writes, "The Catholic prelate had walked the battlefield littered with corpses and wished to give a decent burial to the soldiers and allow their families to gather." There are ossuaries all over the world. There's an ossuary in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, that displays the skulls of 5,000 people who were killed during the reign of the Khmer Rouge and buried in a mass grave. The government encourages people to visit the memorial so that these atrocities will not be forgotten. Ossuaries serve many purposes. They help us find room in cemeteries. They might represent religious purposes like helping a soul move on to the next stage or reminding us of deeply spiritual principles of things like the afterlife. They help people show respect for and mourn those that they have lost. They remind us of important historical events, and of course each ossuary represents a history of its own. But perhaps most importantly, just like the skeleton decorations that we take out on All Hallows Eve, they remind us that skeletons represent more than death. They are a reminder to make the most of life. They're not just a symbol of the dead, they are also a symbol of hope and rebirth. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.